Dylan had never imagined he would be stationed on a distant planet, far from Earth, but here he was. The planet Talonis was a strange and beautiful place, full of alien life and culture. As part of a peacekeeping mission, Dylan's job was to interact with the locals, ensure peace was maintained, and learn about their way of life. The locals, known as the Xinthians, were unlike any species he had ever encountered before. They were tall, graceful, and had a certain elegance about them that was almost otherworldly. But among the Xinthians, there was one who stood out more than the rest. Zora. She was a member of the royal family, a powerful figure within the Xinthian people. Dylan had heard stories about her, tales of her strength, beauty, and intelligence. It was said that she had the wisdom of ages and the ability to command entire armies with a single glance. Her long silver hair shimmered under the twin suns of Talonis, and her skin was the color of the night sky, smooth and flawless. She was, without a doubt, a sight to behold. Every time Dylan passed her, he couldn't help but stare. It wasn't out of disrespect, but admiration. Zora had this presence, an aura that made everything around her seem dull in comparison. There was something captivating about her, something Dylan couldn't quite put his finger on. At first he thought he was just another human in her eyes, someone who didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But every time their eyes met, there was a brief moment, just a second, when he swore she seemed to notice him. And every time, she would look away quickly, her expression unreadable. Zora never said a word to him, but Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that she was aware of his gaze. He tried to act normal, focusing on his work, interacting with the other Xinthians, and making sure everything was running smoothly. But his thoughts always returned to her. What was it about Zora that made him feel this way? She was powerful, untouchable, and beyond his reach. Yet he couldn't help but watch her whenever she was near. Zora, on the other hand, had noticed the human who always seemed to be looking at her. She couldn't understand it. Why was he staring? Xinthians did not interact with humans the way they interacted with their own kind, and yet this human seemed different. He didn't look at her with fear or reverence. No, his gaze was something else. It was something she hadn't encountered before. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper. But why? Zora was used to the attention of others. Being royal meant that she was always surrounded by admirers, both of her people and those from other planets. But Dylan's gaze was different. It wasn't the same as the others. She would see him, standing at the edge of the room or across the plaza. His eyes, following her movements. When their gazes met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Zora couldn't explain it, but it made her uneasy. She had never been one to think about relationships or emotions. As a royal, she had been trained to focus on the needs of her people, to remain composed and powerful, never letting personal feelings interfere with her duties. But Dylan's gaze made her question everything. What did it mean? Was he just another soldier trying to understand her, or was there something more? The idea of someone, especially a human, feeling something for her was strange. Zora didn't know much about human emotions, but she had heard stories from the ambassadors. Humans were known for their passion and their intensity. Perhaps that was what this was, a human's interest in her. But why him? Why did he stand out so much? In the crowd? She couldn't help but feel the urge to know more. One day, while Dylan was walking through the market district of Talonis, he caught sight of Zora again. This time, she wasn't surrounded by her usual guards or admirers. She was alone, walking through the crowd with a graceful stride, her eyes scanning the marketplace as if searching for something. Her presence made everything around her seem insignificant. Dylan's heart raced as he watched her approach. He was frozen in place, unable to take his eyes off her. She stopped for a moment to inspect some of the goods being sold by a vendor. Her eyes were focused, but Dylan noticed that for the first time she wasn't paying attention to him. Her gaze seemed distant, lost in the world around her. Dylan knew this was his chance. He took a deep breath and walked toward her. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew he couldn't keep standing there hoping for a moment of acknowledgement. He had to speak. As he got closer, Zora's sharp eyes flicked toward him. For a brief moment, their gazes met again. Zora's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. There was a faint look of curiosity in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by that familiar expression of indifference. "Excuse me, Your Highness," Dylan began, his voice steady but his heart pounding. I couldn't help but notice that you seem to spend a lot of time by yourself." Zora raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to someone speaking to her so casually. "I prefer it," she replied, her voice cold but not unkind. "There are few who can keep up with me." Dylan nodded, not intimidated by her response. "I understand," he said, trying to keep the conversation going. "But don't you ever wonder about the people around you? I mean, they admire you, but do you ever feel alone?" Zora was taken aback. She hadn't expected such a question. Most people wouldn't dare ask her something so personal, but there was something in Dylan's eyes, something that made her pause. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply regarded him with a look that made Dylan wonder if he had crossed a line. For a moment, there was silence between them. The bustling marketplace seemed to fade into the background, and all Dylan could focus on was Zora's presence. It was as though the universe had shrunk down to this one fleeting moment. Then, just as quickly as it had started, Zora spoke. "Why do you keep staring at me, human?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm. Dylan felt his face flush. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he didn't want to lie. I don't know. There's something about you, something I can't quite explain. I admire you, Zora. You're different from the others." Zora's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing in response. Instead, she turned away, walking off without another word. Dylan watched her leave, his heart still racing. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to stop watching her. Not now, not ever. The next few days were tense. The planet Talonis was peaceful, but the political situation between the Xinthians and a neighboring species had started to grow unstable. Dylan's mission was to ensure the peace treaty was upheld, and the Xinthians, though peaceful by nature, were preparing for possible conflict. It was no longer just about diplomacy, it was about survival. Dylan had hoped the mission would bring him closer to understanding the Xinthian way of life. But as the threat of war loomed larger, his thoughts were consumed by Zora. He had confessed his feelings for her, but that hadn't changed anything. She still hadn't acknowledged what he said. She still looked at him with that strange, unreadable expression. Every time he saw her, his heart ached with longing, but he knew it was hopeless. She was a Xinthian princess, and he was just a human soldier. Despite his feelings, Dylan had a job to do. The peacekeeping forces were called to coordinate with the Xinthian military to prepare for a possible invasion. It was a long and grueling task, but Dylan took it in stride. He was used to the tough work that came with being a soldier. However, every night when he laid in his barracks, his mind drifted back to Zora. His admiration for her only grew as he learned more about her. She wasn't just a princess, she was a leader. Dylan had overheard conversations between Zora and other high-ranking Xinthians, and it was clear that she was intelligent, strategic, and deeply dedicated to her people. Her voice commanded attention, and she spoke with the wisdom of someone much older than her years. It was no wonder the Xinthians regarded her with such respect, but still there was that distance between them. Zora never sought him out, and Dylan had stopped trying to make contact. He wasn't sure if she was avoiding him, or if it was simply the way of the Xinthians. Their culture was different from human culture in so many ways. In a world of powerful alien species, emotions and relationships often took a backseat to duty and tradition. The day of the mission came when Dylan was assigned to work alongside Zora. The Xinthian military had made it clear that they needed human soldiers to help with strategic planning and logistics. Zora would be leading a team to protect key locations across Talonis. Dylan was selected to assist her in securing the outer regions, where hostile forces were most likely to attack. Dylan had mixed feelings about the assignment. He had worked with many Xinthians before, but working so closely with Zora was different. She had always been untouchable, a figure of power and mystery. Now they were going to work together, side by side for the first time. As they met in the command room early that morning, Dylan noticed how effortlessly Zora took charge. She stood tall, her eyes scanning over the holographic maps and tactical data projected before them. Her mind was sharp and she absorbed the information with ease, guiding the team in their mission. Zora barely acknowledged Dylan's presence when he entered. She nodded to him briefly before returning her focus to the task at hand. Dylan understood that this was how she operated, focused, driven, and unflinching in the face of danger. But even so, he couldn't help but notice the subtle glances she cast in his direction The next morning, the sun had barely risen over the rugged mountains when Dylan and Zora were already preparing for another mission. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, and despite the looming danger, Dylan felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced before. The last few days had been intense. The avalanche, the hours spent moving from one secured location to the next, and the constant tension with Zora had worn him down. Yet through it all, there was one constant: his feelings for her. They hadn't faded. If anything, they had grown stronger. Every time she spoke to him, even in the most businesslike way, he found himself drawn to her. And it wasn't just the way she looked, though that was enough to make his heart race. It was the way she carried herself, with confidence, with strength, and with a purpose that was hard to ignore. Dylan had come to admire Zora in ways he hadn't thought possible. She was more than just a soldier, more than just a leader. There was something about her that called to him. Today they were tasked with a more dangerous operation. Intelligence had suggested that the enemy was planning an ambush at a nearby canyon pass. If they could secure the pass, they could prevent the enemy from advancing any further into Xinthian territory. It was a crucial mission, and Dylan knew that they needed to succeed. But as they geared up for the mission, something felt different. Dylan's heart beat faster as he stood beside Zora. She was checking her equipment, her movements precise like a well-oiled machine. She didn't even glance at him. The cold, professional distance between them hadn't changed. But there was a nervous energy building inside of Dylan. He couldn't keep pretending that his feelings for her were nothing. As they set out, trekking through the rocky landscape, the silence between them was deafening. Zora was leading the way, her focus unyielding. Dylan tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was hard. His mind kept wandering back to their last conversation, when Zora had looked at him with an unreadable expression. She had spoken so little since then, and he was left wondering if she had even thought about what he had said. The day wore on, the air growing warmer as they moved deeper into the canyon. The terrain was steep and every step had to be calculated. Dylan was keeping a close eye on Zora, watching as she expertly maneuvered through the rugged path. There was no doubt in his mind that she was an incredible leader. She made everything look easy, as though the danger surrounding them were nothing more than minor inconveniences. Finally, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon. The enemy forces were supposed to be positioned below them, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Dylan and Zora took cover behind a large boulder, surveying the area with careful eyes. The tension between them was palpable, but Dylan tried to focus on the task at hand. Zora turned to him, her expression serious. "Stay alert," she said. "We don't know when they'll strike." Dylan nodded, trying to shake off the nervous energy building in his chest. He couldn't help but glance at Zora once again. Her eyes were sharp, but there was something in the way she looked at him. Something different. It was almost as if she was searching for something, waiting for something. He didn't know what it was, but it made his heart race all the same. Without warning, the silence was shattered by a loud explosion from below. Dylan's instincts kicked in immediately and he dropped to the ground, grabbing his weapon. Zora was already on her feet, taking control of the situation. "We need to move now," she shouted, her voice commanding. They scrambled down the rocky ledge, making their way toward the source of the explosion. The enemy forces had begun their attack and the battle was already underway. Dylan could hear the sound of blaster fire in the distance, the crackling of weapons discharging. As they moved forward, Zora suddenly stumbled, her foot catching on a loose rock. Without thinking, Dylan reached out to grab her, steadying her, before she could fall. The moment their hands touched, Dylan felt a surge of warmth rush through him. It was an unexpected sensation, one he hadn't experienced before. Zora pulled away quickly, her eyes narrowing. "I'm fine," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. Dylan could tell she was rattled by the sudden chaos of the attack, and for a brief moment the mask of control she always wore seemed to slip. "I know," Dylan said softly, "but we need to stay focused." Zora nodded, her expression returning to its usual calm. "Right, let's go." They continued to move forward, working seamlessly together as they navigated through the chaotic scene. But despite the danger, Dylan's mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the moment when their hands had touched. It wasn't just an accident. It was something more. For the first time, he felt as though there was a connection between them that was more than just professional. As they reached a small outpost, they encountered a group of enemy soldiers. Zora moved with precision, taking out the first few attackers with ease. Dylan followed her lead, his training kicking in as he fought alongside her. But in the heat of the battle, Dylan found himself thinking of nothing but Zora. Her strength, her focus, the way she moved with such purpose. She was everything he admired, and in this moment he couldn't help but wonder if she could ever feel the same way about him. After the fight was over, they took a moment to catch their breath. Zora leaned against a nearby boulder, wiping the sweat from her brow. She didn't speak, but her eyes met Dylan's, and for the first time, there was something in her gaze that made his heart skip a beat. Dylan opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply took a step toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. "Zora," he began, his voice barely a whisper. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What is it, Dylan?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. But in that moment he realized there was no more hiding. He had to say it. "I love you, Zora," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I've loved you from the moment I saw you." Zora's eyes widened slightly, her mouth parting in surprise. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze softening as she looked at him. It was a moment of silence, a breathless pause in time. Dylan stood there waiting, his heart in his throat. Finally, Zora spoke. "I didn't know," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. And in that moment, Dylan realized that for the first time, Zora didn't look at him with confusion or indifference. There was something in her eyes now, something that made him feel as though maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand. After the battle, the days that followed were quieter, but they were no less intense. Dylan had confessed his feelings to Zora, and though her reaction had been a mix of surprise and confusion, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She had told him she didn't know, but her eyes, soft and hesitant, seemed to tell a different story. But, despite the brief moment of connection, Zora had gone back to her usual self. She was still the strong, determined leader, focused on her mission and the safety of her people. And Dylan? He was still the human soldier, one among many, doing his duty without complaint. They continued to work together side by side on missions to fortify the defenses of Talonis. Zora led with precision, always thinking 2 steps ahead, her confidence never wavering. Dylan did his part, following orders, doing what needed to be done. But in every quiet moment when the tension of the day faded and the camp fell into a temporary silence, Dylan found his thoughts returning to her. He couldn't help it. Every time their eyes met, a part of him hoped to see something more. A flicker of recognition, a softening of the walls she had built around herself, but it never came. Zora had returned to her routine. She would smile at him, but it was the same distant smile she gave to anyone else. She was a leader, and he was just a soldier. It was clear to him now that she didn't see him the way he saw her. She had never known what it felt like to be in love with someone. Not like this. Not with someone so far beneath her in rank, in status, and in power. Zora was above such things. She had always been. But that didn't stop Dylan from hoping. He continued to do his best to show her how much he cared, even in the smallest ways. He would make sure she had everything she needed, would check in on her when things were calm, and would stand by her side during every mission. One afternoon, as they walked through the training grounds after a long day of planning, Zora turned to him, her face as unreadable as ever. "Dylan," she began, her voice calm, but there was something in the air, something that made his heart race. "I appreciate everything you've done for Talonis, for my people. But you need to understand that we are not the same." Dylan felt his stomach drop. He had feared this moment. The moment when Zora would make it clear that there was no future between them. She was a princess, and he was just a soldier. Nothing could change that. "I understand," he said quietly, his heart sinking with each word. "I know I'm not your equal. I'm just a human, but that doesn't change how I feel about you." Zora looked at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Feelings are not enough, Dylan. You must understand that, you must accept it." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he tried to keep his composure. "I know," he said again, this time with more strength. "But that doesn't make it any easier." The days after their conversation were quiet, but the air between Dylan and Zora felt thick with unspoken words. They still worked together, still fought side by side, but there was a noticeable distance that had formed between them. Zora had made it clear that they could not be more than allies, yet Dylan couldn't let go of the hope that somehow things might change. The war, which had been steadily approaching, was now at their doorstep. The enemy forces had begun to move in, and the Xinthians were doing everything they could to hold their ground. Dylan's role as a soldier had never felt more important. He threw himself into his work, focusing entirely on the mission. Zora, too, was consumed by her duty, leading her people with strength and determination. The two of them had never been closer to danger. The battlefields had become a constant reminder of the fragile nature of life, and every day they fought felt like it might be their last. But despite the danger, Dylan couldn't ignore the way his heart still raced when Zora entered the room. When their paths crossed on the battlefield, he was still in love with her. On the third day of their latest mission, they found themselves on the outskirts of a Xinthian city, preparing for an impending assault. Dylan and Zora stood together, scanning the horizon. The city they had sworn to protect was vulnerable, and they had no choice but to fight to the last breath. Zora, as always, remained calm and composed. But Dylan noticed that there was something different about her today. The usual sharpness in her gaze was gone. Instead, she seemed tired, not physically, but emotionally. For the first time, she looked like someone who was carrying more weight than she could bear. As they walked toward their next station, Zora spoke quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, her words carefully measured. Dylan looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She glanced at him, her eyes softening. "About how you love me." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. "Zora, you don't have to." "No, I need to say." "This," Zora interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "I've always been so focused on my duty that I never let myself think about anything else. But lately, I've been questioning myself, questioning if I've been too closed off, too distant." Dylan's heart pounded in his chest. He had never expected Zora to acknowledge his feelings, let alone admit that she had been thinking about him. But there was something in her voice that told him this wasn't just a passing thought. She was truly wrestling with her emotions, something that Dylan hadn't seen before. "I'm not sure what it means, but I can't deny that I feel something when I'm around you," Zora continued, her eyes not meeting his. "It's more than just respect. I don't know if it's love, Dylan, but there's something there." Dylan couldn't speak for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent so long hiding his feelings, burying them beneath his duty, but now here she was telling him that she felt something too. "Zora, you don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "We're in the middle of a war. All that matters is that we're here, together, doing what we can." Zora finally turned to him, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like ages. "But I need to figure this out. I need to know if I can trust my feelings. If I can trust you." Dylan smiled gently. "You don't have to trust me all at once. I'm not going anywhere, Zora. But right now, we need to focus on this mission. We'll figure the rest out later. Together." She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time in a while, Dylan saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't the perfect, unshakable leader anymore. She was just a woman, facing the same uncertainty and fear that anyone else would feel in a war. "Thank you," Zora said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not used to this, feeling vulnerable, but with you I feel like it's okay." Dylan nodded, understanding more than she realized. It's okay to be vulnerable, especially now. They stood in silence for a moment, just looking at each other, the noise of the battlefield and the distant hum of weapons and machinery, a faint background to the quiet understanding between them. It was a moment of peace in the chaos. But as the day wore on, the battle became more intense. The enemy forces were pushing forward, and the Xinthians were doing everything they could to hold them back. Zora and Dylan were once again at the front lines, fighting side by side, their movements synchronized like they had done 1,000 times before. But now everything felt different. Every step they took, every move they made, it was like they were fighting not just for their planet, but for each other. Dylan knew that this battle could be their last, but if it was, at least they would face it together. They fought through the day, pushing the enemy back, defending the city they had sworn to protect. Dylan and Zora were unstoppable, their connection stronger than ever, a silent understanding that bound them together. When night finally fell, the enemy had retreated, and the city was safe. For now. But the cost of the victory was heavy. The battle had claimed lives, both Xinthian and human. Dylan and Zora stood together, overlooking the aftermath, the weight of the day's events settling on their shoulders. Zora turned to him, her face tired but resolute. "We've done it," she said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and relief. Dylan nodded, but he could see the toll it had taken on her. "We've won, but the war is far from over." Zora's gaze softened, and she stepped closer to him. "Dylan," she said quietly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I'm not ready to lose you." Dylan's heart swelled with emotion. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "You won't lose me. Not now. Not ever." For a long moment they just stood there, letting the words hang between them. It wasn't a promise of forever, but it was a promise of something real. A chance for them to be together, despite the war, despite everything standing between them. And for the first time in a long time, Dylan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a future after all. The days after the battle were quiet, but the weight of the war was still pressing down on everyone. Dylan and Zora had grown closer than ever, their bond solidified by their shared experiences on the battlefield. They worked side by side every day, strategizing, protecting their people, and keeping the peace on Talonis. But there was something new between them now, an unspoken understanding, a connection that had been forged in the heat of battle, and it was something neither of them could ignore any longer. It was the start of something different, something more than just a military alliance or professional relationship. It was a quiet, blossoming promise of something that could become more. As the war continued to drag on, the two of them spent more time together, not just in their roles as soldier and leader, but as something else entirely. Dylan found himself thinking about their future more often than not. He had never imagined he would fall in love with someone like Zora, but now it felt like everything was falling into place. They had fought together, bled together, and survived together. What more could they ask for? One evening, As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Dylan and Zora stood side by side watching the horizon. The battle had quieted down for the moment, and there was a sense of peace in the air, even if it was just for a short time. Zora turned to him, her face tired but filled with determination. "Dylan," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking about what you said. About us, about everything." Dylan turned to face her, his heart racing at the thought of what she might say. "Zora, you don't have to—" "No, I want to," she interrupted, her eyes meeting. I've spent so long being focused on my duty, my people, and the war. I thought that if I gave in to anything else I would lose myself. But I realize now that I've been holding back something I don't want to lose. And that something is you." Dylan felt his breath catch in his throat. The words he had been longing to hear were finally coming. Zora, the woman who had always been so distant, so untouchable, was finally letting down her walls. And she was letting him in. "I don't know what the future holds for us," she continued, her voice more vulnerable than Dylan had ever heard it. "The war isn't over. There are so many uncertainties, but I do know that I want to face it with you by my side." Dylan's heart swelled with emotion. For so long he had feared that his feelings for her would never be returned, that she would always be out of his reach. But now, standing in front of her, he realized that all the doubt and fear had been for nothing. "I don't know what the future holds either, Zora," Dylan said, his voice steady but filled with feeling. "But I do know one thing. I want to be with you. I want to face whatever comes next together. No matter what happens, I'll be there for you." Zora smiled, and it was a smile that reached her eyes, a genuine expression of warmth and affection. For the first time, Dylan saw her not as the leader of an entire people, not as the powerful, untouchable figure she had always been, but as a woman who was willing to open her heart to him. And that was everything. "I've spent so much time fighting for everyone else, Dylan," Zora said softly, "that I forgot to fight for myself. I forgot to fight for what makes me happy." Dylan reached out, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to fight alone anymore. I'm here, Zora. We'll fight together." She squeezed his hand, her gaze filled with something Dylan couldn't quite name,